to introduce today's speaker. Before I do so, I would just like to provide the land acknowledgement. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. GEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. And I think this is particularly poignant given the horrendous news that we learned within the last week as reported from Kamloops. And I think it's something that we all need to give some thought to. Today's speaker is Dr. Michael Cheng. Michael is a staff psychiatrist at GEO and associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Ottawa. He is based off-site at the Montreal Road site. He works with children, youth, and families by reconnecting them to people and experiences that bring purpose, hope, and meaning. As a father of 2 children, married to a family physician, he's been trying his best to survive while working from home and running a home daycare at the same time through this incredibly challenging time. His title for today is Helping Children and Youth with Anxiety During the Pandemic, Information for Pediatricians. And I couldn't think of a topic more relevant to today. So I'll give you the floor, Michael.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duffy. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you everyone for taking time out of your schedules to be here with us today. And I'll start by saying, I too, although I'm a psychiatrist, I see a lot of kids with anxiety. This whole situation is unprecedented. So I'll do my best to give you some ideas on what I found helpful during this unprecedented time, which is really code for we don't have any RCT trials yet. And I look forward to maybe getting some interesting ideas from our whole group here. So here are the usual disclosures, and we'll start with the case. So you get an email to call an old friend back. And when you call your friend says, I'm worried about my son/daughter. Since the pandemic, they've been anxious, worried about everything. Lately, they just want to be on their room all day on their screens. They don't want to do anything. They had a meltdown when I tried to sign them up for summer camp. What do you suggest? So I'm sure you can all relate to this situation, the hallway consult from a friend or a friend of a family or acquaintance. So before we talk about anxiety specifically, let's just talk about some etiology, pathophysiology. So let's just take a look at human history. So for most of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. And then maybe 6,000 years ago, we had early civilization with farming. And then in 2010, we had tablets and smartphones. And then of course, we had the COVID pandemic. So for most of human existence, it's helpful to note that we lived as hunter-gatherers or farmers. And as hunter-gatherers or farmers, we had very traditional lifestyles, quite different than the modern day lifestyle of sitting in front of a screen that many of us live nowadays. And children spent their days physically outside, active, doing day-to-day activities necessary for survival with their parents, their tribe, their extended kin. And that is what gave them a sense of belonging, purpose, and meaning. And this explains why our brains are wired to require the following things for wellness. We need our physical needs to be met naturally: food, shelter, sleep, movement, nature, time. We need a sense of belonging and attachment, part of which comes from face-to-face connection from family, but it also means feeling that you belong somewhere, feeling that you are accepted for who you are. We need a sense of purpose, which is activities which keep us busy and occupied. Humans need to be busy. They just can't sit around all day. We need a sense of meaning, which is For some of us, we're very lucky. In this field, our purpose is about helping kids. And our job, our career gives us sense of meaning. But I have some friends who are in the federal government and maybe they're not so happy with their work. It doesn't really give them purpose. And so we all also need meaning. Meaning is knowing that our lives make a difference, whether it's as a parent, a family member, or having a passion, pursuit, a hobby or something. And hope is knowing the future will be positive, which for many of us, I'm sure means hoping that everyone gets vaccinated and the kids can go back to school. And I should acknowledge this is directly from the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. And it is interesting that in the colonizing society, we are suffering an epidemic of mental health issues. And I just wanted to highlight a lot of the traditional knowledge that we actually benefit from our First Nations, Indigenous, Métis colleagues. The problem with the pandemic is it has disconnected people from what normally helps. And so we've been disconnected from what we usually need for mental health. And for many of us with kids in lockdown and with the teenagers I see, of course, I'll see the most extreme examples, but with the extreme kids I see, they're basically on screens all day for school, and then they're on screens the rest of the day, playing video games, social media, video games, and frankly, even during school, they're playing Among Us or other video games anyways. And through the technology, they are disconnected from sleep, they're disconnected from nature time, face-to-face with humans, and they're connected via screens to peers, which unfortunately only gives you conditional acceptance. You're only liked or appreciated based on certain attributes, but it's not unconditional. You're not loved no matter what. And today's kids are connected to all sorts of interesting values and meaning, whether it's hedonism, materialism, consumerism, or other types of, perhaps we'll say, not so comforting values. Just last week, it's interesting, I'm seeing kids who are part of the far right in various conspiracy theories, and thanks to the internet. What we can say is that modern pandemic life has not been good for child and youth brains. And I think if we took any one of us and forced you to spend time in a Google Classroom all day and then put you on Instagram and TikTok, you'd probably get pretty depressed as well. And for many families, we have even additional worries such as food insecurity, basic needs issues like housing, finances. And if you're First Nations, then there's the effects of colonization, systemic racism, discrimination. And as Dr. Duffy mentioned, with the news this week, one cannot help but think about that and how that makes the world appear to be a very scary place for a lot of people. So today's talk is going to be focused on what we can do in the office mainly, but definitely there are wider systemic issues that we need to do if we are really going to try and help kids feel safe and have less anxiety, not to mention the parents. So let's talk about screening for anxiety. So there's a headset mnemonic, which you guys are all awesome in using. And so I use a modified version of the headset often myself. And I started with the pandemic. How are things at home, with school, etc. So that's a great way to screen. And then if you do detect anxiety, there are screening tools that you might use. This is stuff we would often use, maybe give a little handout to someone in a primary care setting, and then they fill it out and give it back to you. Or you can just ask them these questions. So this is the Scared 5 item. And what's nice about it is they're simple questions, and it's a great screening tool. Interestingly enough, a lot of these have to be really adjusted based on the pandemic. And then for those of you who really like screening questionnaires, there's the 41 item Scared, which goes into more depth and can actually give you a sense of whether it's generalized anxiety, social anxiety, or OCD, or other types of anxiety. And most of us don't use questionnaires, however. So for history, high yield questions are: when did it start? How did it start? What symptoms do you see? What are the stresses or triggers? This is a great question because then we can problem solve these things later on. And pervasive is, does it happen in many settings? Another simple way to ask about anxiety is to use an anxiety scale. For younger kids, developmentally younger kids, we can use between 0 and 5, or some use 1 to 5. And it's nice to get a nice baseline, because then you can track progress over time. If there was just one question I would ask about anxiety during an interview, it would be this question: between 0 and 5, how's your anxiety? Or for older kids, we can use the question between 0 and 10, how bad is your anxiety? And these are the classic anxiety disorders, which we as psychiatrists like to differentiate. But I know in a primary care setting, a pediatric setting, it's more than enough to just say they have anxiety. And there are related anxiety questions and conditions. The DSM-5 actually puts PTSD and OCD in separate categories. And these are helpful to screen for, because then it might change the types of treatments we provide. And for a lot of kids that I see where we have anxiety, troubles leaving home, unable to participate in activities, often they have other issues like ASD. ADHD should be here as well, but there's other conditions, of course, which can explain why they're anxious. So let's move on and talk about treatment and management. First, are the parents struggling? Because if the parent's struggling, any intervention you do is going to be pretty challenging. So if the parents are struggling, we can support them. We can do the usual talk on self-care, but it's hard to tell parents to take time for themselves, because they all know that. And so I find it very practical to prescribe social support. Social support is asking them about what type of specific support they need. Do they need help with someone doing laundry, or do they need help with someone to watch the kids? And then we ask them, who should I call to ask to help you out? And that's the idea of prescribing social support. These are all things which would have happened automatically, interestingly enough, in a more traditional society. And it's in this modern society where we have smaller families, we don't even know our neighbors, that we have less of this built in. Self-compassion, we get regular emails on this topic, which is validating that this is a normal thing to feel overwhelmed at times. Everyone feels this way, and it's okay. We'll get through this. And there's a new service called Access MHA, which is one number to call for mental health services for adults. So assuming the parents are reasonably functioning, we can then move on and support the child. If it's mild issues, we can start with education about anxiety. These days, there's a lot of talk about talking about daily routines, self-regulation strategies. And today we're going to talk about something as well called hunt-gather-parent strategies, which is using traditional strategies that humans have used for millennia, which seem to have helped kids be healthy in the past. And if the issues are severe, then of course we all know we can refer to mental health services. And there's a new service in town. It's called One Call, One Click. And that is meant to be one place where you can call to access child and youth mental health services, as opposed to having to call YSB or Crossroads or CHIO intake. Now, let's say you're seeing a patient and issues are so severe you decide to refer to mental health services. So while you're waiting for services, let's talk about other things you can do anyways. So everyone knows about dental hygiene, and now there's more and more attention since the pandemic to, actually everyone's about dental hygiene. Now there's more and more attention to what we call mental hygiene. So what's that? So we alluded to this earlier with families. I'll talk about how this is how we live most of the time. And what did we get when we lived this way? We had our physical needs met, like healthy food, sleep, face-to-face connection, activities that kept us busy. And later on, we talk with families on how to reconnect to some of those things intentionally in their daily routines. And in the discussion about anxiety, this is a very helpful model. We have anxiety because at some level, our body's alarm is going off. And we have an alarm system because it's designed to protect us. When a saber-toothed tiger approaches you, it gets you into a state of fight or flight or freeze. And that allows us to fight the danger or take flight. It's incredible. I find most teenagers have learned this concept somehow in gym class or biology class, so that's great. And what used to help us feel safer wasn't psychiatrists or counselors in the past. What used to help us feel safer was just reconnecting to those things we did, like continuing to be outside after the acute stress, continuing to move and hunt or farm after the acute stress, continuing to be connected to family, friends, neighbors, community. And those things are naturally what provide wellness and are therapeutic. The problem with modern society is that our alarm, although it's designed for acute stress, it's not so good for sustained chronic stresses, which are always there at the back of our mind, like the pandemic, like worrying about finances, like not being able to see your friends, like having to sit in front of a screen all day, which is sensory overloading, like not being able to see people's faces with the mask. So we can appreciate why on so many levels this time is stressful. So when I'm educating families, I do use virtual slides now. I used to give them a handout or use whiteboards, but now we're all virtual doing Zoom encounters. So I actually have a slide deck, and in case you're interested in them, here is a link to that slide deck. You can try it out, modify it, adapt it for your purposes. And here's the old style handout that we used to give. You can still email them a link to that. And with kids who are anxious, oftentimes this anxiety is due to the school or it spills over into school. So inevitably, it's usually helpful to let the school know that the child is struggling with anxiety. And some of the key words are accommodations and modifications are essential. And then we can make some general recommendations. The schools are trying their best, and they do acknowledge that virtual schooling and the whole system right now is just overwhelming for a lot of kids. What's next? Well, now since the pandemic, we're doing a lot more work on actually teaching people about self-regulation. And the idea is that self-regulation is something we all try and do, even if you guys don't give a name to it. And the problems we're having with stress, anxiety, depression, and mental health, it can all be seen as a problem with self-regulation. So one popular model used in schools is based on the zones of regulation model. So here's a model adapted from that. So here are the main zones. And our zones that we can be in, or the different feelings we can be in, or the states are the following. We have the understimulated bored zone, when you're not getting enough stimulation. So right now, I'm sure some of you are maybe fidgeting, moving around. Maybe you're drinking a coffee. Maybe some of you are even checking up on your emails at the same time. That's all fine, because you're just trying to self-regulate yourself. You're trying to increase your stimulation so you can get into the green zone. The green zone is where we want to be. The green zone is just right. It's when our brain has optimal stimulation. And when things get stressed out, when you get worried about things, anxious about things, read something scary on the news, that's the yellow zone. When we're so overwhelmed, we can't even think about things or can't even deal with our feelings, we're in the red zone. And then shut down is for chronic trauma, where people can go into dissociation. So in a bit more detail, the green zone is when we're just right. And when we're just right, we can be calm and able to focus on school and work and play. Parents have a challenging job because they both have to self-regulate themselves. In other words, stay calm and keep themselves in a good green zone. And by doing that, they model it for their kids, and they have to co-regulate their kids as well. So when kids get upset, they have to help their kids co-regulate. And we use the term co-regulate because many parents think that it's simply about telling your kids what to do, but co-regulation is actually being there with your kids to help them calm down. What keeps us in our green zone? We mentioned all these things earlier, like getting enough sleep, outdoor time, contact with people, etc. And every person also has those other additional things which keep them in the green zone. Another zone that many kids struggle with these days with the pandemic and being stuck at home with families all day is that they don't get enough stimulation, not enough physical stimulation, not enough emotional stimulation, not enough social stimulation. And when bored, some kids know healthy ways to get more stimulation, like asking if there's any chores to do or going to play outside. On the other hand, other kids have less healthy ways, such as fighting with their siblings, using too much screen time, which then, interestingly enough, leads to overstimulation and other issues. And so our usual recommendation if kids are understimulated is provide daily household chores and activities. Many parents come to me and they say, my kids are bored. They're complaining they're bored all the time. And at which point I ask them, well, what would happen if you complained to your grandma that you were bored? At which point it's interesting. Many parents will say, oh yeah, I would never complain to my grandma because then they would give me something to do. So just like I'm sure, Nona, your kids, your grandkids never complain to you that you're bored, right? In terms of physical stimulation, that's the idea about getting more physical activity and more nature time. It's interesting, we all know this, but the studies do actually show that with the pandemic, many people are actually getting less physical activity than previously. And so the idea is that in the child schedule, we want to work with the parents and write down what sorts of activities would be helpful and embed those in the daily routine. And we want to have both stimulating times that give high dopamine and adrenaline, but also mindful times, which are times which give you low dopamine and low adrenaline. Yellow zone. Well, you're here because you wanted to learn about anxiety. So anxiety can be seen as the yellow zone. The yellow zone is when kids start to get stressed out. It could be anxious, worried, but it can also be sad. And this is the zone when we get emotional. Our limbic system becomes overloaded. We don't respond to logic or advice. And when people are upset, that's why they don't respond to our advice, like calm down or let's do your deep breathing. In fact, with many of the families I see, if anything, they're seeing me because these things haven't worked. And so for many kids, actually, parents telling them, let's do deep breathing is actually a trigger for getting things worse, not better. So it's ironic, I find, because oftentimes they get that advice from some well-meaning professional. So it's not that it's bad advice. It's just that in this zone, it doesn't work. In this zone, when our loved ones are upset, they want us to listen and be empathetic. So I know many of you are probably saying, yeah, this is logical. This makes total sense to me. And yet this is one of the things that so many of the families we work with, they struggle with this basic concept. And so teaching this basic concept can make such a huge difference. So what do we do if our loved ones are in the yellow zone? Well, we said we don't give solutions, don't give advice, we give support. So we simply validate that this is stressful, this is scary for you. Let me give you a hug. It's good to cry it out, let out your feelings. This is the secret to psychotherapy. We have all these psychotherapies, whether it's CBT, psychoanalytic psychotherapies, interpersonal psychotherapies. And the secret of many of them really is just we validate people's emotions so that they can cry it out. And parents too can do this simple yet powerful strategy. After kids get calmed down from the yellow zone, they hopefully go back into the green zone. And that's the zone where parents can give all that advice and problem solving that they want to do. This is where, if the child is calm now, this is where, if the child is having anxiety, such as vaccine hesitancy and worries about getting COVID, this is where you can do that logical problem solving. But you can't do it when they're stressed out and emotionally upset. Okay, so if you want to learn more or have a template that you could fill out with families, we have some templates here on ementalhealth.ca. And let's talk about the next part, which is daily routines. So we talked about talking about self-regulation, which is working with parents to figure out what gets their kid back into a green zone. And once we figure that out, then we try and embed those things in their daily routines. Prior to the pandemic, we had our routines, and for most of us, those gave us what we needed. Things were good enough. And since the pandemic, we've lost all those things. And many kids have been left to their own devices to try and fill up their own time and schedules because parents are overwhelmed and busy. And so this is what many kids have filled up their schedules with. This is what we're seeing in our mental health services, that most of the day is spent in front of a screen. And so with parents, it's helpful to do that exercise of asking them, what do we need for your child's mental health? And then we purposely try and fill those things in the schedule. And we try and nudge people. So this is an example of many things, but with many of the families I work with, I'll see them the first week, and then we just work on one thing, like maybe making sure every day you're spending some time together, eating lunch outside. Or next week, it might be, let's start to set an electronic curfew. But step by step, we try and nudge families towards healthy routines. In terms of a very high yield strategy, it would be activating parental controls, and so that devices can shut down by 8 or 9 o'clock. So the pandemic has no doubt been a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. When we talk to people about how's the pandemic been for you, people will tell you about all the stresses, but interestingly enough, it's nice to hear about the little pockets of benefits. Like earlier today, talking with Mariana and Dr. Duffy, we talked about how, interestingly enough, more people attend pediatric grand rounds now, thanks to Zoom. And so there are definitely some benefits that hopefully will continue on after the pandemic. And one of the interesting strengths we've heard from a lot of families is that many families are telling us that now that our kids aren't having to do soccer, 3 nights a week, or their hockey, or their dance, or their other activities, we're closer as a family. And so this brings us back to what humans have always done for the majority of human history, is that we've actually connected to each other through survival and household chores and daily activities. Kids in the past didn't have, extracurricular activities. They just did stuff with the village. And this is the idea of hunt, gather, parent. So this is actually the experiences of a woman, Dr. Michelin Dukloff, who had a modern daughter who had modern society behavioral issues, and all the standard Western stuff didn't help her daughter. But then she and her daughter traveled to various traditional societies, like Mayan societies in South America, like Inuit society in Canada, like African hunter-gatherer societies in Africa. And she saw that they didn't have the same struggles that we do. And she wrote a book about her experiences. And this has actually become a bestseller during the pandemic. It actually is not new in that her observations echo what many anthropologists and other researchers have noted for decades. This is a very famous anthropologist, Jean Briggs, who worked with the Inuit in Canada, and she documented well her experiences. But Dr. Michelin Dukloff wrote a very practical book for the average parent. And so the research is that in a traditional society, kids seem to have less issues with saying, I'm bored, and they have less issues with depression and suicide and anxiety. In a traditional society, everyone needs to contribute to survive. And so from an early age, parents involve their kids in daily activities. And when kids are young anyways, they want to be around and help out. The moment they walk, they want to do something to help out. And parents harness that, as opposed to telling them to go watch TV while they make dinner. So by the time kids are older, they're voluntarily helping out without needing to be asked. And teens don't sit around while others are hunting or gathering or farmer. Parents don't need to use reward charts or give allowance or scream at their kids. So what are some of the healthy things that she noted? So Dr. Dukloff summarized her observations about the principles that seem to work in doing this. And she calls it the team approach. T stands for together. In traditional societies, children are generally always around some adults, as opposed to modern society, where we put our kids in environments like school and daycare, where they're outnumbered by peers, and so kids become peer-oriented. So the recommendation would be to try and find ways, we have to be creative, but try and find ways to keep our child and youth close to us with more family and adult-oriented activities, as opposed to just peer activities. E is for encouragement. In traditional societies, children are encouraged to contribute to daily activities, and parents are grateful, as opposed to modern society, where parents have chore charts and use reward systems. So the idea is we try and find ways to encourage daily activities in a more gentle way and be patient with it. But don't let our kids sit around while adults are doing chores or tasks. Autonomy is the fact that it's an interesting paradox. On one hand, parents ask their kids to do more, but if a child doesn't want to participate any given time or day, parents actually back off and let the child make their own decisions about when and how they want to contribute. And we'll talk more about this later. And then M is for minimal interference. This one was interesting. In a traditional society, parents interrupt kids much less. And so kids feel their autonomy is infringed upon less. In a Hadzabe community in Africa, parents gave children commands about 3 times an hour versus an American playground where parents were observed to give their kids instructions at least 60 times per hour and interrupting their kids 60 times an hour. So the idea is don't interrupt your kids unless it's a safety issue. Try and use other strategies. So how can we apply these towards modern society? Well, one example would be this. And even still, I notice this in some Zoom meetings. A parent is doing their parent thing. The child comes into the room. Parents get annoyed or upset. Well, this actually wouldn't happen in a traditional society. If a child interrupted a parent who was hunting, the parent would just involve them in their activities. So what we can do is we can at least acknowledge our kids want to connect with us. Welcome, good to see you. We can introduce them to our coworkers. This is a great thing to do if you don't want your kids to come back again, actually. We can try and be creative, ask your child to sit beside you or just watch, and don't get upset or displeased if they want to connect with you. And even with the work I do, I am working as a child psychiatrist. I'm often talking about very sensitive things with teens or parents. But interestingly enough, when my own kids come in, I introduce them to the parents. They find it real. They find it human. E is for encouragement. So instead of doing tasks on your own, encourage your child to join you. So do tasks together with the child, which gives them a sense of purpose and connection. It gives them a sense of mindfulness as well. So when you do things such as activities like cleaning, it's actually mindfulness. As a parent at CHIO, I get these emails frequently, yoga during lunch hour, or extra yoga classes. Frankly, I don't know about you. I don't have an extra 30, 60 minutes a day to do daily yoga, but I have to do vacuuming anyways. Doing it with the children is actually a form of mindfulness. In Zen Buddhism, Buddhist monks will actually sweep for several hours a day as part of their mindfulness practice. What if our kids don't want to help out, or what if they're too young to really help out? The idea that Hunt Gather Parent talks about is how we can divide it into smaller subtasks. So we can find usually something that they can do. And if they can even do that, that's a start. So if the child is too young to help, just ask them to watch or hold something for you. Can you hold these keys for me? Can you fetch something for me? And when they do something that you like, don't praise them. Just say, thank you for your help. And if you do really need to criticize, use the sandwich technique, which as professors and teachers, we all know is give a positive, then give the negative or the constructive feedback, followed by a positive again. Instead of going to groceries on your own, in other words, instead of doing hunting and gathering on your own, try to involve the kids. Try and give them a chance to go to the grocery store. And it's funny as I say this, Mark Tremblay pops into my mind, and the idea about instead of driving, you should walk to the store and have active transportation. So how can you challenge your younger children? Let them search for things for you in the store, help them, let them cross things off a list, scan things at the chart, push the shopping cart. With older kids, you can probably just ask them, give them some money and have them go at it and buy something special for themselves. Now, a real issue for a lot of the kids that we see is that they're not getting enough sleep. And so as parents in Western society, there's the usual, what we call imperative statements, which is telling them, go to bed, go to sleep. But in traditional society, actually, different strategies are used. Actually, did I take out that slide? Yeah, I think I did. There was previously a slide on this great French-Canadian strategy, which is French Canadians don't tell their kids to go to bed. They tell them about the bonhomme de 7 heures. Just out of curiosity, does anyone here French Canadian? Anyone want to tell us about bonhomme de 7 heures, so we can get it from the source? Miss Natalie, tell us about the bonhomme de 7 heures for all the non-francophones out there.
Yes, when I was a little kid playing outdoor, my parents would come out and say, it's the time for bonhomme 7 heures, it's time to come in. And you had to do your routine to get in bed. And it didn't take very long for us to have to comply.
So I'm sorry I took the slide out. I'll try and put it back in for the other deck that you guys get. But in traditional societies, there's a lot less nagging from parents, because from an early age, kids are taught about legends and stories about bad things that happen if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So parents don't have to tell you to come in, because you're coming in because you don't want the bonhomme de 7 heures, the boogeyman of 7 o'clock, to kidnap you. And Inuit society has great examples of this. Inuit parents don't nag their kids, put on your hat, put on your sweater, because they have a story about the Northern Lights. And if you go outside without a hat, the Northern Lights will take your head off and play soccer ball with it. Or in Inuit society, the parents don't nag the kids to stay away from the thin ice, stay away from the shore when the ice is thin, because they have a story about a sea monster where if little kids get too close to the sea monster will snatch you away. And so that's a great way for parents to not be seen infringing upon kids' autonomy. So it's interesting. I've been experimenting with this. My kids are older, right? So the story of a monster in that way doesn't work, but you can still adapt this. And so my kids now know that there's an anger monster, and that if they wake up their parents too early, the anger monster takes over the parents and makes the parents irritable and take away TV privileges. And so it's almost a fun, jokey thing with my kids. But as kids get older, of course, with teens, we're not telling our teens about the monster per se, but it's all analogy. And so we can still tell kids about the consequences. And so it's interesting, although it's often harder for parents to hear this from, kids to hear this from their own parents, I'll do this talk with the kids. And interestingly enough, it seems to fit better. And this is the part about how I think another issue that we have is the loss of external networks. If we have more aunts and uncles and other neighbors and other adults telling kids the same message, that makes it more powerful. Here's another practical application about just telling them this scary story in modern times. So if you want to get your kids off screens or social media, just watch a scary TED's talk or scary documentary with your kids about screen time. Now, many of you probably came here wanting to learn about anxiety, so I should probably mention a few classic things about anxiety, like the Cvt Exposure Hierarchy. So many times parents will come to us and say, my kid doesn't want to leave home, or my kid won't put on a mask. And so the classic Cvt strategies we can use is the idea of doing everything step by step. And the goal that we can help parents with is to help them break it down into smaller steps. And so if they have a fear of masks, then you can break it down into little steps, like saying the word mask, looking at it, images of mask, touching a mask, putting on a mask at school. And if a kid can't do a certain step, then it means we have to break it down into a smaller step. And you can use this approach, this philosophy for really anything. Now, let's say you've tried various strategies, it's not working. What about medication? So I can't give a talk about anxiety as a psychiatrist without mentioning that, of course, SSRIs can be helpful if nothing else has worked. And so the first line SSRIs for school-age kids 6 and above would be sertraline, fluoxetine, or fluvoxamine. If that doesn't work, try another one of the first line ones. And if that still doesn't work, consider venlafaxine XR. And this is from the CANMAT guidelines on anxiety. Is the child or youth still struggling? Well, if so, then call oneclick.ca. which is our new one central intake to call for mental health issues for children. So let's get back to our case. You get an email to call a friend and they tell you, I'm worried about my son and daughter. They've been anxious and worried about everything. What do you suggest? So you first provide empathy, validation, and support to your friend, as opposed to jumping in with your awesome advice. And after the support, then you give advice, which is you validate that this pandemic has disconnected from us from what we need. And then you mention the power of household chores and daily activities. And then finally you say, it's been too long, let's meet up for a bike ride sometime. Okay, so we've talked today about how the pandemic has contributed to anxiety. We've talked about resiliency factors, and we've talked about ways that we can work with children, youth, and families to help their brains and bodies feel safer during this unprecedented time. And so for more information, please check out ementalhealth.ca, which is a website that I work on, and an initiative of CHEO. We have lots of resources such as patient handouts. And if you're looking for clinical practice summaries as a pediatrician or a primary care provider, we have information on ementalhealth.ca, our primary care version. And if you liked this talk and want to learn more about child and youth topics, consider signing up for Project ECHO. This is an initiative that myself and Hazen Gandy and Kathy Pager are involved in, and it's basically free CME during your lunch hour for you or anyone on your team. If you want to learn more about self-regulation, here's some resources about that. If you want the slide deck about it that you want to try out with your patients, here's a slide deck for that. And if you liked the hunt, gather, parent ideas, including, I didn't mention too much of it, but it's the idea of how you can give commands without giving a command. So actually, I'll mention a few words about that one. So spouses are great with this one. So my wife knows how to give me a command without actually making it a command. So she doesn't actually say, Mike, do this or do that. She'll say, Mike, it looks pretty dirty. And then, of course, that's her way of giving me a command, which is she wants me to help clean it up. So that's what is often done in traditional societies. Instead of directly telling kids, do this, do that, they use a series of questions, or what we call Socratic questioning as medical educators. And in that way, it's a way to more subtly get people to do what we want, but without infringing on their autonomy. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
So thank you very much, Michael. That was really an excellent overview. I've no doubt that there will be lots of questions. One question that I have is, you know, in my clinical practice in rheumatology, I see a lot of adolescents who are referred for whatever the rheumatologic symptom is, but I find that there's a high proportion who are now on SSRIs or on stimulants, and I'm just wondering about, you alluded to the transition piece in terms of the approach to management of anxiety, and then ultimately to when you know moving to the introduction of SSRIs. Can you give us some guidance as to when should such a decision be made? Because it does seem to me, at least, that there's much more frequent use.
Yeah. So on a global level, I do believe that much of the anxiety that kids have is because of the stresses of modern society. It's an anxiety-provoking society we live in right now. And we give SSRIs because for some kids, they can tone down the alarm and result in less society. But if the core issue is that they're not getting enough sleep, or they're not getting enough outside time, if they're not getting enough face-to-face time, if they're not able to get all those things which give purpose, hope, and meaning, then of course their alarm is going to get triggered and they're not going to feel safe. And so I find it's a tough one, because sometimes as physicians, we are stuck. We know we've tried, someone's tried parent education, someone's tried counseling, And so hopefully as professionals, we make sure they've tried those things first. And then we're prescribing SSRIs when people have tried everything else and it hasn't worked. But even though we often do prescribe SSRIs, I still feel in my mind, I still sometimes feel, wow, if only we could go back in time 50 years ago when there was no Instagram or Facebook, this kid would actually probably not need SSRIs because they would have a healthier lifestyle that's a better fit for their hunter-gatherer brain. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it's not an easy one. Anyway, thank you. Other questions or comments from those who've been listening in?
And actually, if I'm happy to have questions, and I'm also very happy to hear if you have any brilliant insights during this unprecedented time on how you have helped your own kids or other families with anxiety, especially about the hunt-gatherer hypothesis one. Bonjour Mylène, est-ce que vous avez une question?
Yeah.
Oui, merci. J'ai une question. Thank you so much, Michael. That was an amazing talk. As a pediatric oncologist, mom of 2 high school and 2 grade school kids, I feel like your talk was extremely helpful, not only for myself, but for talking with my patients, obviously. I'm really interested in the comment that you made about thanking children for performing chores rather than praising children for performing chores. Can you expand a little bit on the rationale for that?
Yeah, so the praise movement, some of the theory on where did it come from is that, well, the truth is traditionally for millennia, hunter-gatherers didn't praise their kids for helping out. It was just expected, right? And I'm sure your great-grandparents didn't praise their kids or give them allowances for helping out on the farm. It was just expected. But somehow in the 70s, people did experiments on rats. Actually, if there's psychologists in the audience, you can help jump in on this one. But this is my understanding that we did all these experiments on rats in mazes, and we found that we could motivate their behavior using positive rewards. And then so people said, well, maybe we need to motivate kids' behaviors using positive rewards. And praise was one of those. And then there was also the self-esteem literature that showed kids who are happy seem to have better self-esteem. So maybe we should boost their self-esteem by telling them how awesome they are. And so we now realize it doesn't work that way, and that actually boosting self-esteem by praise actually just creates narcissism. And we're seeing the results of what happens when you have a whole culture and a whole country of narcissists like the country south of us. And so there's a lot of issues with praise. And so that's why a lot of the newer attachment-based stuff, which actually fits with traditional parenting stuff, is just moving towards gratitude. So when we thank kids, we're accepting them for who they are. So that's acceptance, makes them feel safer. And it's also giving them more internal motivation. We want kids to do our chores, not because they're awesome. We want kids to do their chores because we're grateful, and that's what you do in a family. So thank you very much for sweeping up. And as parents, we can relate to this. And as a spouse, we can relate to this. Like if my wife does something awesome, I don't say, good job, Mireille. I say, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Because if I say good job, then it comes off as condescending to my spouse, and then she's gonna, slap me or something. Actually, yeah, I know there's in this population, I probably shouldn't use that joke. So, but I could go on and on about why praise is so powerful, but that would be a little segment on that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
And you can definitely remind me, actually, Mylène, just email me through the CHEO system. I have a whole handout on why praise is a more powerful strategy.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. It kind of validates me telling my kids, you have to do this because you have to do this and you're part of the family, as opposed to doing it because I'll pay them for it.
Yeah. And since you mentioned that you have to do this, so yeah, you're in this dilemma, right? In modern society, we as busy parents have often taken on a lot of these tasks, or we've outsourced them. And then so our kids don't do as many tasks as they might have done 50, 100 years ago. So for many of us, like for me too, since learning about the hunt-gather philosophies, it's been a slow road, gradually getting my kids to do more and more and more. But you know what? It's it's all about the nudges, right? If you can nudge your kids to be 1% more helpful, then hey, over 100 days, they're 100% more helpful. So I will use your example and just say something about imperative versus declarative statements. So if you want to know more about this, our speech language pathologist friends can tell you about this, because we use this in other areas. But it's about using gentle questions as opposed to just telling people what to do. So with a child who has social skills issues, we often might just say an imperative, which is go say hi to your grandma and look her in the eyes when you talk to her. That's an imperative. But when you do that all the time, kids' alarm systems go off, and then they have a backlash because it's a threat on their autonomy. So declarative statements, which were traditionally used more, and which now we use in treating kids with ASD and other issues, it's where you make an observation. So you might say, oh, look, it's your grandma. What are you going to say to her? You know, or with you, well, actually, this is what my wife does to me on the weekend. She'll say, oh, look, the room is a mess. And then, you know, I'm trained. She's trained me, so I know what that means. But she would ramp it up, right? If I said, oh, yeah, you're right, the room is a mess, right? So early on in the relationship, I'd probably be stuck at that level. Yeah, you're absolutely right, the room is a mess. But, you know, she has a way of ramping it up closer and closer. And it'd be like, well, I guess I can't clean it because I'm doing this. And I guess if the room's a mess, well, I guess we can't do such and such fun activity, right? And so that's the other one about chores. So with many families I see, and myself included in the past, we've toyed around with, you know, should we reward kids by doing chores? But in a traditional society, the reward is the next activity, which is the fun activity. So when the chores are done, when you fed the animals, then you get to eat. That's the reward. And so you can use rewards by daily routines. So anyways, thanks very much. Great question, Madan. I should probably go on to the next one. Any other questions from anyone?
It's Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. This is fascinating. I guess when I was trained and when I was growing up, the fear things were not thought to be a good thing. So like the bonhomme de setter and all of that, but it sounds like it swung back to that not being harmful, because I thought that would provoke more anxiety.
Yeah, so this is what I'll say. I think it's a big, it depends. I think for most kids, that the bonhomme de setter would be fine for most kids, but it could also be about how parents present it, right? There's, depending on the parent you are, there's like the bonhomme de setter, which is like, you know, a very, very scary thing, but it could be, it needs to be presented in a way that fits with that child and what works for that child. And so that's what I'll say with any intervention, you know, whether it's psychotherapy interventions or even parenting interventions, at the end of the day, we do have to take into account how the child is.
Other questions? Don't see any hands up. And I don't see anything else in the chat. So Roger.
Oh, Roger Zemek. Roger Zemek's iPhone. Welcome, Roger Zemek's iPhone.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I just wanted to follow up on your comment earlier with praise. I was listening. There's a great Adam Grant's a popular psychologist who does a lot in the media as well. And he was talking about the variations of ways that you could praise, and rather than praising the person for who they are, praise their action. So for example, rather than, there was a study where they randomized kids and gave them a math test, and you know, the kids who did well said, oh, you're so smart. And other kids they randomized and said, oh, you worked really hard on that. And they purposely gave the kids a super hard test, which there was no way they could complete because they were developmentally not able to do it. The kids who were told you were smart got really frustrated, anxious, upset, and their self-value went down. Whereas the kids who were randomized, oh, you worked really hard on that, had more positive attitudes and stuck with it. I just wanted your thoughts on that. Is there a tweak or more nuance to praise versus the other strategies?
Oh, Roger, I completely agree with that. And that is great research. And so there's been a lot of little parenting tips from that, catchy blogs such as top things to do for your kids. And one of the top things for emotional intelligence is don't tell them they're smart, but thank them for working hard, for example. So I would agree with you. There's so many nuances for that. And so the idea is, from a psychological perspective, we're moving the locus of control to something that they're in control of. So you can control that you work hard, but you can't control if you're genetically you're lucky to be born very high IQ or not. So it's about moving locus control. And then I would agree with that research. And I'd also add that the research also shows when you praise kids and tell them they're smart, they give up more easily later on when they face challenges. Or if you tell them you work hard and it is going to be hard often, then they're going to work hard in the future. So completely agree with that.
So I don't see any other hands or anything else in the chat, and there are no other iPhones chiming in that I can see. So I'd just like to thank you, Michael. Excellent presentation. A lot of good advice, and look forward to how all of this may be put in practice, and we see better outcomes as a consequence.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to thank Mireille Cloutier for your comments. So this is great. This answers Christine's question. So the bonhomme de 7 heures can be changed depending on the child. And in Mireille's family, the bonhomme 7 heures wasn't a scary, nasty figure. It was someone who came around to make you sage, to make you smart before bedtime. So that's great. And then, so actually, something I'm going to say is that it all depends on the kids. So for the kids who are anxious, you're going to need a nicer bonhomme de 7 heures. But when I'm working with a youth who, is ADHD, who is maybe has a bit antisocial psychopathic traits, they are going to need a scarier bonhomme 7 heures in order to motivate behavior. And so there you go. Thank you very much, everyone. Sorry I jumped in, Kieran, because I got so excited with the comment, but I'll let you say the final words.
No, just to say thank you and wish you all the best in your work. Very important.
Thank you very much, everyone, for all your comments and learnings. I've learned a lot today.